Great. Okay. I think we will get started. I know there's still people filtering in, but tight schedule. So we'll get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. So welcome to today's webinar, the series where we revisit some of our previously funded GHNF and HNIP funded projects. In this webinar, we're themed around harnessing heat from rivers and waterways. So looking at naturally occurring sources of heat and how we're utilizing them, and how organizations are able to unlock that innovative new projects to help decarbonize our homes and buildings, with the help from the government support that we're providing through the GHNF and its predecessor. So before we get started, just to run through the usual housekeeping, I'm sure you've all heard this a million times before, but just covering all bases. So the session will be recorded. The recording automatically started when I hit start event. The video, the recording and the slides will be available and they'll be distributed at some point after the call. Now this should all already be the case, but if not, please make sure you turn off your cameras and microphones unless you are speaking. Now the Q&A function is live on this webinar, so if you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat and our speakers can pick them up either after the presentation or we'll have a Q&A, a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the call. And if you have a question that you would like to sort of just say out loud, then feel free to just raise your hand using the raise function at the top of your screen. So just going through the agenda. So I will be handing over in a second to Alex from AECOM, one of the delivery partners for the GHNF, to go through sort of a bit of an introduction to the technology, providing a bit of context, how we can use innovative sources of heat like naturally occurring heat in rivers and waterways. And then afterwards, we'll be hearing from two of our funded projects. So we'll be hearing from Amy from Bring Energy to talk about East London Energy heat network, and then from John and Jason at Vattenfall to talk about the Bristol heat network. And then afterwards, as I said, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll do some closing remarks, and that'll be done by Sam Shea, one of my colleagues at GemServe at Talent Company. So without further ado, I will hand straight over to Alex.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michael. And good morning, all. And thank you for joining us for this session. Mine is very much a high-level introduction before bringing in Bring and Vattenfall to look at their projects and the sort of stages they've reached, which hopefully they're sort of different stages, which can help to sort of pick out on particular themes, and some of the themes hopefully that I'll cover in my introduction. Next slide, please, Michael. So I like to start, being a sustainability consultant at AECOM, I like to start with a little reminder of why we're here, why we're talking about this theme really in the first place. You know, the planet is finite, so obviously resources and managing resources is important, and you know, driving efficiency and so on is important. But sort of almost a step before that, you know, we really have this immediate challenge of climate change. Fossil fuels are a key component to that, and this is what we're trying to avoid or trying to minimize. At least we can't avoid it; it's happening. But can we find ways of reducing that? And you know, this is where you know, the UK in particular has moved things along. And if Michael, you could go to the next slide. It highlights, so on here I've pulled up you know, it's a bit out of date information, but the main thrust of it is correct. The UK has really pushed very hard to decarbonize one particular area, which is the electricity supply, and of course that sort of leads to what opportunities can we do to utilize this transition, and think about what we do with our energy consumption and avoiding the use of fossil fuels. And ultimately, this is making good progress. However, one aspect is that it's not cheap to do this, and I'm sure we hear a lot about this in the news, the cost of energy in the UK, and what my fellow presenters are experiencing with developing their heat networks, and trying to manage that effectively is really critical. So if you can take us to the next slide, Michael. That's where we start talking about water source and water source heat. So what we're predominantly focusing on is taking what is available in the environment and using heat pumps, electric heat pumps. So thinking back to the transition the UK is making, and the availability of lower carbon energy, and using heat pumps to displace what we would use for heating in terms of fossil fuels. But the specific advantage or the things to consider with water source heat really boil down to water itself having a relatively high specific heat capacity means we've got a lot of thermal inertia, and of course that feeds into heat pumps having access to consistent temperature, and also avoiding these swings that you might get, say, with air source heat pumps. And there's more consistency as well from bodies of water, steadier temperatures, fluctuate less, more consistent through the seasons, all of those sorts of things, which are the benefits. And how this translates is ultimately it's a overall expected higher performance from this way of generating heat. So the combination of the two, you're more likely to, say, compared to air source heat pumps, to get a higher overall efficiency, and that is obviously a useful thing to be considering in developing our transition to another source of heat. Next slide, please, Michael. So it's taking maybe a little bit of a step back and thinking, well, how have we got here, and what are the opportunities we have? So start making me think. Obviously we've got in the UK and across the world, for that matter, thousands of years of people migrating and changing and utilizing rivers, and ultimately building up around rivers, and building the waterways themselves. And that's what we see. We see in the UK we have several towns and cities that have grown up alongside these areas, and with that comes demand and heat demand. So we may well have seen a reduction to some extent of how we use these waterways and rivers, but maybe we can think of it as, yes, there's this opportunity here to aid our transition and seek to decarbonize heat, and that's so where we've got to. I think probably one important thing that we can consider here is that these rivers are often taking energy, replenishing energy right into the heart of some very, very dense heat demand areas, and that's again why we end up considering it as a potential source of heat. Next slide, please. So then we start thinking about, well, which are the good areas, which are the good locations, and there's lots of resources and data to do this initial feasibility. We've got maps, we've got historical data that's published and available, and we can use this to actually drive some analysis to understand what is available, and obviously we need to be drilling into the specifics of what is available at a particular site, and then potentially go a bit further in terms of understanding what are the limitations that are there. But as a starting point, there's some useful information out there that can get us going. Next slide, please, Michael. So what this might look like is taking what's available in terms of flow rates, say in the river, in this particular example, temperatures, and having a bit of analysis in terms of what could be extracted from the river. So what kind of flow rates are we talking about that are available in the river? We obviously need to be thinking that there are implications, or could be implications, on the river in terms of its ecology, and that's where, say, the Environment Agency play a key role in allowing access, and this is then done on the basis of what is physically there and what's happening, what other particular requirements that the Environment Agency might have based on the local environment and the ecology there. But if we were to take some broad brush analysis, we can make assumptions around what flow rates there are in the river, what temperatures, and then make a judgment as to, yes, a proportion of that. So, potentially in this case, 5% of the river flow. What does that mean? And initially we could be thinking, well, in summer we might be able to reduce the temperature of that water that's abstracted, and reduce that, say, by 5 degrees, and then discharge back into the river. And you could potentially, in this case, achieve something around 6 megawatts of heat. I mean, another thing to consider, of course, is that rainfall tends to increase in winter, and you tend to get higher flow rates, as we're seeing in this data set, which could also then increase the capacity in the winter period, which actually is also then aligns quite well with the demand. The heat demand, that is. So some of these things could be worked through, and obviously there's a certain amount of optimization in terms of what heat pumps and equipment would need to be, and is appropriate to specify, and of course that engagement with the Environment Agency to understand what the limitations are, and build on those as you kind of get through to the next sets of analysis. Next slide, please. So then there's the point around perhaps how it sort of integrates a little bit more with the thought around heat networks. So not even in a densely urban area where there is a river, not all sources or heat demand has access to said river or waterway, and that's where heat networks really play a potentially very, very key role in providing that access to the river source, as well as the other benefits of the heat network can bring in terms of economies of scale and so on, and the ability to a change between sources of heat and the like. One of the points mentioned earlier was around the efficiency and the benefits of seasonal efficiency that you might get from water source heat pumps, and that seasonal efficiency gain is something there can also help to offset some of the distribution losses, say, in the network, and of course the often relatively high cost around constructing the network in the first place. That being said, the complexities that I'm sure the other presenters on the call know all too well of actually delivering a heat network and engaging with all the different stakeholders to get such a scheme and project off the ground is challenging. And then combine that with some of the points I was mentioning around engaging with the Environment Agency and addressing those specific challenges is for a site is very complex and needs to be considered right from the get-go. Next slide, please. I suppose delving into a little bit more of the detail of what we need to be thinking about. If it were a river that you're trying to gain access to, you obviously got the river to consider in terms of what's allowable, what's going to impact the local ecology. You've got what happens to the river on a daily cycle, or through the seasons, the depth and the flow. How does that vary? We saw some of that in the data example I was showing. Are there any changes that need to happen to the actual river to be able to gain access? Is that even possible? What permissions would you need to do that? And that includes quite often, certainly in urban areas, a retaining wall. How do you breach that? How do you navigate that to be able to get access to your source? And there are lots of different ways of approaching that, but some of them may well be impacted by what it is, and also the ownership of that wall. And then we're putting these, ultimately we'd often putting them quite near to that source, the river, and of course rivers, there is a risk of flooding, and that needs to be considered in the analysis and understanding the risks and how you adapt your design to accommodate that. So all of these things need to be factored when working through a solution. Next slide, please. I wanted to throw this one up. This is actually from my local town, Tunbridge in Kent, and the River Medway. And I took this actually quite a few years ago, but specifically with the idea that, what could actually happen in Tunbridge? There is no heat network. There may well never be a heat network, but if there was, and the River Medway could well be a source of heat. I did observe this, and the two shots are the same location on a bridge, but a few weeks, roughly a month apart. And essentially, what had happened here is that at Tunbridge there is a flood barrier. There is a risk of flooding in Tunbridge, so they built a flood barrier. And what they did is they used this flood barrier in order to do works on the riverbank and upgrading a wall. So this took a few weeks. And I think probably what I'm doing here is I'm just highlighting that, whilst there may well be historic data, there may be periods of time where none of that changes, do need to understand the context and the potentials for reduced access to that source. And of course, understanding what the implications are of several weeks or a month or more, where that heat source is not available, and what temporary solutions can there be to accommodate that. Please. And I think this is actually my last slide. So I think wrapping up and sort of touched on a number of these points through my presentation, was this kind of understanding that it's quite a complex ask when we're thinking about using water source from rivers and waterways. There are many stakeholders to engage with, not least all of those that would happen with a heat network and developing a new heat network anyway. The specifics of the access to the river or waterway will need that very early engagement, and it is one of those that needs to be understood with the development of the scheme, and whether there's realistic it is realistic that it would align with the timelines of that wider development. And potentially one of the things that's worth considering and working on is there scope to have a short and a medium term approach, and can a scheme get off the ground, for example, to disconnect the development of a wider scheme and the source of heat, and have an interim solution that such that once a scheme is developed, and then alternative and or additional sources of heat could be considered to increase capacity of a network, and then also potentially the efficiency of the network, giving overall improved performance, and hopefully getting at least the project off the ground in the first place. Next slide. I think that's the last one. Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. That was all really very insightful. There's lots of questions in the chat. However, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker, Amy Baker from Bring Energy, who's going to talk about the East London Energy Project. We'll answer some questions in the chat just by responding, or there is a Q&A function at the end that will get to some of the others. So thanks, Amy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Amy Baker, and I work as a transition program manager for Bring Energy. And essentially, my role looks at the decarbonisation and how we manage that process on our Olympic Park scheme, also known as East London Energy. Next slide, please, Michael. So just as a really quick overview as to who we are, so we operate 13 city centre scale schemes. We do the kind of financing, design, construction, maintenance and expansion, and have over 30 years experience doing this across multiple residential and commercial premises. And we do this in partnership with public sector bodies, who I'll touch on later as well. Next slide, please, Michael. And just as a very big overview, like I say, we have lots of city centre schemes ranging from Edinburgh, Newcastle, Birmingham City, Birmingham, Coventry and Leicester, and then down south in Southampton and in London we have Battersea, the ExCeL Exhibition Centre, and the scheme that I work most closely on is the Olympic Park, which I'll talk a bit around now. Next slide, please, Michael. So I wanted to go through this presentation just giving a bit of a context as to how we came about deciding on the water source heat pump and how we kind of got to this position. So for those of you that don't know, essentially back in 2005, we won the bid for the Olympic Games, which is essentially a design, build, operation and maintenance contract for 40 years. And so all of that work was done at the time of the Olympics to make sure that there was heat on for the Games, and that was back in kind of 2010. And since then, the Olympic Park has undergone massive redevelopment and really grown a lot. Primarily, the park is served from two decentralised energy centres that are predominantly gas combined heat and power, biomass and gas boilers. And since kind of 2021, we've been working really closely with the London Legacy Development Corporation and Westfield, who are the concession employers, on the decarbonisation roadmap and plan and how we do that, which is essentially how we've got to this position. Next slide, please, Michael. So to give again a bit of context around how we got to this position, we've essentially gone through a bit of an iterative process around looking at a real long list of all the opportunities for harnessing waste heat across the Olympic Park. And from them, we kind of stripped it into 3 different roadmaps that we thought could be viable, looking at kind of different heat pumps, energy from waste, and deep geothermal as well was another one. And from them, we worked really closely with the LLDC and Westfield in terms of what would actually make a kind of viable roadmap that we think could actually be deliverable within the timescales that we wanted it to be, but also providing a kind of incremental decarbonisation route that meant that we were ensuring that it was a just transition for everybody that was already connected and not forcing everybody to decarbonise ahead of regulation. So broadly, this considers 3 different activity layers, which we call system optimization. So trying to increase the network efficiency, reducing heat losses and reducing temperatures, which would then have an impact on ensuring a higher coefficient of performance overall. These incremental decarbonisation projects, which I'll touch a little bit on in the next slide. And then also strategic opportunities, so where we could harness really quite large sources of waste heat or recover waste heat from different sources across the Olympic Park as well. Next slide, please, Michael. So when we were doing this process, one of the things that came up was that we wanted to try and harness as much waste heat from the bounds of the Olympic Park as possible. I put on here our kind of first heat pump, which is a 3.2 megawatt cooling recovery heat pump, which recovers waste heat from the chilled network. And originally, when we first started at looking at this, we were looking at both the canal and the river as different opportunities for harnessing waste heat sources from both of those two different bodies of water as well. As we were saying before, we did also look at kind of the opportunity of air source heat pumps and other geothermal opportunities as well, but we really saw the kind of highest benefit in terms of output that could be achieved against kind of costing as well from the water source projects, which is why our second project, which is the River Lee, was prioritised for development and designed to be submitted as part of our Green Heat Network Fund application. Next slide, please, Michael. So essentially I wanted to give a bit of a timeline of kind of how we got to where we are now and how long that took, just for kind of some wider context. So we really kind of started focusing on the river back in early 2023, making sure that we had kind of temperature sensors and flow monitoring going on so we could get a full year. And I think we ended up with kind of 18 months prior to the application and a really good understanding of how those temperatures fluctuated across the year. And enough information that we thought we could give a bit of an overview as well, and enough information for a planning application. So once we understood that, we did a lot of location optioneering about where we would actually put this project, which again, I'll touch on in the next couple of slides. And from there, we took it to Aruba Stage 2 to 3 design. We submitted the pre-application for the abstraction and discharge license to the EA. Subsequently, we did planning submission to the local authority, and then that just takes us kind of up to date, which is where we ended up withdrawing the planning. Again, I'll go through all of this as well, and you can see kind of in that timescale where we decided to submit a Green Heat Network Fund application based on how far we'd completed the project to date. Next slide, please, Michael. So like I was saying, one of the first activities that we undertook was trying to understand what land would be best in order to put the pump house that we knew was going to be required for the water source heat pump. I've extracted an image that we had kind of 3 opportunity areas, which essentially was based on a lot of collaboration with the London Legacy Development Corporation in terms of them being able to give us enough information for kind of land ownership, where we also evaluated where this land available was in comparison to not only our existing network, but also the energy centre to try and work out where had the most direct route. Also, we looked at kind of additional obstructions, so road embankments, which also might impact kind of the design as well. We also looked at kind of tree removal and the impact that that might have from a kind of planning perspective. So I think location number 3 had a lot of kind of trees that would need to be removed, and also you can see kind of road crossings and things like that. And also looking at that kind of maintenance piece as well in terms of which of these areas is going to be able to get kind of construction and maintenance. Number 2 by the canal is right by the kind of towpath, which is a really kind of pedestrian, and also if you've ever been to that area, a lot of kind of moored canal boats as well. So following kind of the evaluation of the different spaces that we'd identified, we determined that number 1 was the most viable for the project. Next slide, please, Michael. And so once we had an understanding of where we were going to put this, we then looked at a bit more of the design and how we actually wanted the project to operate. So like I say, we'd got the temperature monitoring and we made sure to design it so it was unaffected by ice. I think when we'd looked at the temperature, there hadn't been ice forming. Obviously, with the kind of changing climate, it was something that we wanted to be conscious of. We also decided to go for an open loop system in this case. And again, the area is quite specific, so the kind of river wall is a lot higher up compared to the actual water flow, so there's quite a big drop between the edge of the river and then where the water actually is. So essentially we would need to make sure the pumps were located actually within the river to also mitigate this open loop system that we're designing. And so this would mean that we would have essentially a permanently flooded suction rather than relying on primary systems. And this would be resulting in positive pressures throughout the pipe network as soon as it rises, above the surface water level, and also aids air displacement as well. So we decided that was kind of the best route for that aspect. Similarly, we looked at having the intake to have multiple stainless steel self-cleaning basket strainers and a continuous backwashing system. And then for the kind of abstraction piece, we had a jetty that would be fitted over the strainer as well to protect them from damage, also providing potentially a bit more mooring space from a planning aspect, but also allows for maintenance and access and bridge that gap between the river wall and the pumps as well. The other thing that we also had to consider was the existing utilities for the flow and return pipe work. Even though it doesn't necessarily look the most developed place, we are still in kind of central London, and there's a lot of utilities within the ground, both for kind of new developments that will be coming up, but also prior existing utilities for the Olympic Games as well. Next slide, please, Michael. So once we kind of had a general overview of the area, decided what we were actually going to be putting in from a design perspective, we then had to look at kind of the actual area and decide where we were going to be putting this kind of plant room pump house as well, which is easier said than done, we found out. It's quite a constrained area. Obviously, it's kind of not there for redevelopment, so there's kind of reasons for that as well. We considered kind of 3 different locations, and you can see there's kind of pros and cons to all of them. Right at the back, we've got the kind of train line, so just above location number 1, which requires maintenance. We have the kind of main sewer running under some of these as well, and some also the kind of sludge utilities as well. A few kind of mature trees in the area, and then the kind of piece just above location 2 is a kind of wall that sticks out, which we were quite considerate of. If we had a pump house in location 2, that could create kind of areas of poor visibility and additional kind of concerns for kind of safety on the park as well. So eventually, kind of after doing a lot of sitting down and trying to work out between kind of ourselves, the LLDC, and WSP, who were helping us with the design on this, initially we decided that we would submit our planning under location number 3 because it was closest to the riverside. We thought we could kind of work with the EA in terms of mitigating kind of maintenance requirements as there. It wouldn't require any trees, and it would kind of fit in nicely with the overarching planning aspirations of the LLDC at the time as well. So location 3 is what we decided to take forward. Next slide, please, Michael. So I'll touch a little bit on how our planning went as well, but some of the challenges that we faced was actually getting an abstraction and discharge system using the Rivoli in this location. As I mentioned, the water level is substantially below the ground level, so there's quite a big vertical lift to get the water up to a usable level. It's also quite shallow across the edges and deeper in the middle, which is kind of how we ended up on that design, like I talked about before, and that water level will really vary depending on the amount of rainfall in the area. As I mentioned, we submitted the planning application in that kind of location 3, as you can kind of see from our architect's image as well, right on the embankment front. And essentially we got rejections from the EA and basically over having that building too close to the river edge. So they have quite strict guidance around having 8 meters space between the river wall and where your building is. And so after kind of 6 months of trying to get a conversation with them and trying to kind of get them to overturn or have a think about their feedback there, we eventually kind of had a meeting with them where we discussed kind of the project as a whole, whether there was any flexibility in this 8 meters or not. And we were essentially kind of told, no, that 8 meters needs to be there, which is then kind of informing our next steps as well. We also got kind of just feedback around if it was to be in this location, we would essentially have to provide a lot of information about the structural stability of this existing flood defence. I think they wanted kind of 70 years guarantee that, you know, that's how long that river wall is kind of okay for. And given even though we kind of have some records from this all being completed as part of the Olympic Games, the amount of kind of cost it would take to undertake a study like that is kind of not feasible at this stage. And the other thing that they mentioned around wanting that 8 meters is so that they could have kind of access for maintenance and emergency response if there was an issue with that kind of stretch of the flood defense wall. So I'll talk a little bit about how we're kind of addressing those concerns as well. But I think one lesson learned from this is definitely, we kind of thought that other projects have been able to get within 8 meters, and we were hopeful that ours would be able to as well. But like I say, one lesson learned is definitely kind of that early engagement with the EA, if that's at all possible. And then the third challenge is we put the planning in towards the end of 2024 and was really kind of pushing to get it in because it would be going to kind of the local authority, which was the London Legacy Development Corporation at the time. Since then, their planning powers have gone back to the local boroughs, and just where this project happens to fall, we would be somehow straddling 2 different boroughs from the abstraction to the discharge location. So we will be now having to go to both Hackney and Tower Hamlets for this project, which just adds a little bit more kind of complexity to making sure that we meet both kind of planning powers or planning authorities requirements for this as well. I think one thing that we have managed to do quite well is limit the number of stakeholders. So I know we mentioned before about the Canals and Rivers Trust, and this stretch of water also isn't monitored by the CRT. So we're quite fortunate in only having to deal with the environmental agency on this piece. Next slide, please, Michael. So I've just got a few bits about timescales. I will also touch briefly on how we're overcoming some of those challenges. So we've done a lot more work around the kind of flood defense and the flood information that the EA requested from us. So we've been working really closely with Bureau Happold around understanding kind of the impact of having the heat pump and the jetty on the wider river system. And actually that's come back really positive in that by having this extra infrastructure in the river, we've kind of shown that there's no increased flood risk at all by having it, which we're hoping to submit and satisfy the EA that we can we're not kind of impacting those systems at all. Like I say, we had that conversation with the EA and we're talking about kind of those different areas that we could house the plant room and the pump house, and they were much more receptive to kind of us moving back to a location 2, which was kind of against the wall but might require some of the trees being chopped down, and they were much more or moved, sorry, and they were much more receptive to that kind of opportunity for biodiversity net gain or increasing kind of algae in the river, something like that, as opposed to kind of having the building on the river wall as well. So essentially what we're looking to do now is to remove that building back a bit, get kind of cracking with the architects and do a bit more design on kind of where we're going to put all of the equipment, if there's anything that we can put in the existing energy centre to kind of make that building a bit smaller as well. And we hope to kind of resubmit that planning probably early 2026 now for consideration by the local authorities and the EA as well. And then, like I say, subject to the planning, we want to kind of crack on with finalising that design and starting construction once we get the wider kind of planning and licence requirements as well. And as I mentioned, we'll be putting the kind of procurement information on the Heat Network Exchange notice board as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Again, really interesting presentation, and good to know about all of the sort of how you been working to overcome any barriers that you faced along the way. Now, again, there are loads more questions in the chat. I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to move straight on, but there will be a Q&A section at the end. And if not, we'll follow up after the call. So just going to pass over to John and Jason from Vattenfall now.
Hi, thanks, Michael. Hi, folks. My name is John Sankey. I'm Head of Business Development for Vattenfall Heat UK. We'll move straight on to the next slide. Whilst I just briefly talk about Vattenfall, actually, the next slide again, please. So Vattenfall are a multi-vector utility and energy supplier across Northern Europe, Swedish state-owned, and we operate heat networks across Northern Europe as well as in London and Edinburgh. In Bristol, our involvement came about as part of the Bristol City Leap project, which was a groundbreaking 20-year partnership tendered to find a strategic partner by Bristol City Council, with whom we work very closely. But between us and Amoresco, we've come together to form Bristol City Leap. Our role is essentially to take ownership of the existing Bristol City Council heat network assets that were developed within the council, and then to develop them out over the course of the next decades. And Amoresco's role is all around all the other kind of energy efficiency, solar retrofit, EV charge points, and so on, across the council's estate. So the council has 27,000 council housing homes, for example, which need to be decarbonised. Many of them will connect to the heat network, many of them won't. And so we work very, very closely with Amoresco on those kind of projects, but also on the commercial estate across the council, to connect buildings up to the heat network and to look at the other projects that we can do in partnership. So Vattenfall owns the Bristol heat network itself, and we will, whilst the concession with Bristol City Leap is a 20-year concession, we will be with essentially the ownership of the heat network in perpetuity. And as part of the project, we'll be kind of delivering a huge amount of investment into Bristol's energy system. So £1 billion is estimated over the partnership, although expected to be larger than that. And over the first 5 years, we're looking at investing nearly £500,000 into the Bristol heat network. We've recently launched our vision, which is to supply that over half of all Bristolians living, working and learning in the city will be kept warm by the Bristol heat network by 2050. So that's whether or not you're working in an office or being educated at a school or university, or indeed living in a home that is heated by the Bristol heat network. We believe we'll be keeping 50% or thereabouts of Bristolians warm. There's a huge amount of kind of KPIs and savings and carbon emission savings and so on that we expect to be delivering as part of that, but a big part of that is also job creation and so on as well. So there's a big economic impact. So that's just a bit of background, really. So with that, I'm going to ask to go to the next slide and hand over to my colleague Jason, who's going to talk through the Castle Park Energy Centre.
Morning, everyone. So as John just referred to there, I'm working on, essentially, I've been a part of this project now for nearly 5 years. I've seen essentially the transition of this project and these assets from the council all the way through to Vattenfall. I'm going to focus on these 3 sections here. So I'll talk briefly around the energy centre, around the project and the timeline, how the funding was applicable to that, before moving into the actual delivery and the operational challenges that we have today. Finally, talk about some of the stakeholders and the engagement that we have actively working on with us on this project on a daily basis. So if you want to go next slide, please, Mike. So Castle Park Energy Centre, we were awarded funding in 2020. We received the amount of £6,590,000. At the time, that was the Bristol City Council, the Energy Service, and principal contractor being Vital Energy at that time. Our project timeline loosely followed what you see there. 2019, essentially, when the project actually kicked off, and construction starting in 2020. The local first old market customer, which was Castle Park View, which I'll come on to in a second, joined in 2021, with the energy centre seeing commissioning in late 2021 and the heat pump being fully commissioned 2022. So one of the key aspects to this work was that we were working on connecting 2 island networks, essentially, in Old Market together, which we achieved later that year, finally, before all of the assets and Bristol City Leap kicked off in 2023. So if you go next slide, please. So just talking a little bit about the history of the site. The actual location used to be a council depot. During the kind of evaluation of the site, it was very much down to a perfect location, being one of the only locations around Bristol's floating harbour, essentially, that was available to work on. There is a colourful history in the way of making sure that it was safe to build on and work on, so plenty of ordnance scans. And then obviously there is a challenge around the actual land itself, as Castle Park and the the remains of the castle essentially are still around the site itself. So we've had to work with a number of stakeholders through that aspect of getting the site up and running and a spade in the ground. What you see actually here with the site itself, so the actual main compound, our main energy centre sits on the left side of that, and we have our auxiliaries for distribution to the right side. We have the floating harbour, so the actual body of water that we are abstracting from in Bristol is it's a fixed body of water. It essentially runs through the whole of Bristol's main canal and joins on to the Avon, which does give us a large benefit, which we'll come on to a little bit later, such as consistent water temps, which obviously gives us that resilience through the year. And the key aspect to focus on here essentially is that there is a key constraint for the actual site itself, which was culverts. So Bristol has hundreds of HM waterways for flood defence essentially that run through the city. You can see one of those that is directly running through diagonally through the centre of the site there. That brought plenty of challenges when it came to actually getting the site commissioned and designed. And we'll come on to those a little bit later as well. So if you want to go to the next slide. So the local network, before we go into the actual energy centre itself, we are running in our market with 2 anchor loads, be that Castle Park View, which is the tallest building in Bristol, around 1.5 megawatts peak or total plate sizing, and the Welcome building, which is on our far end, down near Temple Mead Station, closer to about 1.2, I think, megawatts. The actual network itself, so we have 9 connections, 4 of those residential, 3 commercial buildings, and 2 public service. So we have quite a good variation in demand profile. That leaves us with 20.09 megawatt hours of annual demand, a peak right now of around 2.2 to 2.4 megawatts for peak events through winter, equivalent of 2,500 homes being heated, and a 4.17 kilometers of pipework. System volume, as you can see, everything here, it's a non-chemically treated system, and we primarily export onto the network at 75 degrees with probably an average return of around 50 right now, designed for a little bit lower than that, but that's essentially the challenges of running on a live network. If you want to go to the next slide. So a little bit of focus on the actual energy centre. Castle Park Energy Centre and the heat pump is primarily a heating plant. Our OEM for the install was Star Refrigeration, and also they are the primary stakeholder right now in helping us maintain and look after the assets. It is a 3 megawatt single compressor water source heat pump, primarily using ammonia as the refrigerant, with a designed coefficient of performance of 3.06. With abstraction, so we have a license to abstract 516 meters cubed per hour, and that's 4,512,276 meters cubed per year. We also have the stipulation of a maximum delta from flow to return of the floating harbour of 4 degrees. Filtration itself, so we have 2 lines of defence essentially when it comes to affecting the local life within the floating harbour. We have a 2 millimeter mesh screening on our abstraction point with a backflush system in place, as well as a secondary self-cleaning mussel stop system, which essentially catches any sedimentary material and returns that back to that same body of water. The actual site itself, we hold 90,000 litres of local thermal storage, and it is we managed to get a project just over the line ahead of RHI accreditation and meeting that criteria, so it is also eligible for government benefits. As you can see on these illustrations, so on the left side, that is a snippet into our what we call our abstraction pump room, essentially. So we have our 2 large abstraction pumps sat on the left side of that wall, and the harbour or the primary river water flow, which comes around to our secondary point of cleaning on the right side of that room there, before we move into our actual heat pump room itself. What we see here essentially is just our flow coming into the top of the system before our return comes back out of the other. That flow water essentially travels through two sides of that, through 2 heat exchange sides of the actual heat pump itself, exchanging off of the oil that's used within the compressor to cool down that system, and then also on the actual ammonia itself to aid it turning back into a liquid state after it's gone through the compression cycle. So if you want to go to next slide, please. So fairly wordy slide, but essentially some of the challenges and opportunities I wanted to focus on for this webinar. First of all, I've kind of made a mention to it earlier, but on the environmental constraints has been one of our key challenges all the way through the project length. Those culverts essentially are a environmental agency. There's a requirement essentially that they should be able to access those 24/7, 365 through the year. What that did mean is that there was a exclusion zone essentially for building within there. I think it's 5 meters either side of the actual culvert itself, and no going into the actual ground itself. So what we had to do, and what the design and the actual build landed on, was overground pipe, which was all removable, and essentially not being able to fully satisfy the original design of the plant, which was for a 6 megawatt unit. We had to reduce that to 3 megawatts eventually. We obviously are very interested in increasing that capacity over time, but we do have a requirement to obviously work with our space that we have available to us, and then the land and planning that needs to go along with the master plan that the council has for Castle Park as well. Another challenge we had and we're having today is around the commissioning and operating below the base load of the asset. So the asset being a 3 megawatts asset, originally when we were commissioning, we were around a 1.5, so around half that load. So it did have that requirement of load banks and all the space that would entail, as well as operating with a peak around 2.2 to 2.4 right now. It does mean we see a reduced average operable efficiency. So our co-efficiency is a little bit lower than we would like, or the average. And then obviously, more importantly, a large number of stop-starts, which compressors of this size don't necessarily want over a long period of time. So that's a challenge of increasing capacity and demand on the network, or interconnections of our other island networks, which we have within Bristol. Some of the opportunities that I've identified. First of all, we worked with the OEM on a refrigerant superheating system, so to directly address some of those stop-start cycles that we see on our asset. So essentially, with the cyclic running of the heat pump as we see today, we do have the risk of refrigerant condensing within the compressor. That can cause long-term damage over time. So we have used or utilized some of the returning heat to the site from our DHN to superheat that ammonia suction line to the compressor, which will see a very long-term benefit of protection of the compressor before and after we reach that base load. And finally, the opportunity we have around electrical use optimization. So we are planning to maximize our electrical tariffs and local thermal storage, essentially, to be able to charge the local body of water to the greatest depth and amount that we can. And obviously run off of that during those peak hours. But that does obviously require a larger thermal storage capacity across the city, and is something as well that we've identified within the business that we would very much look at doing for all of our future assets, especially as we move towards more of a heat pump focus. So if you want the next slide, please. With these stakeholders and the level of engagement that we have locally, so we've identified really 5, but we do have a lot of engagement on the actual asset itself. So the council, being a part of Bristol City Lead, they are very close partners with us. They are working with us on the master plan when it comes to the actual park itself, as well as what we would like to do for future development, and any kind of impact on the locally protected area, and obviously 2 public service buildings within that area. So the Bristol Harbour Master locally, we are obviously very closely working with them around any risk or exposure to our actual abstraction points on the harbour. So what you would have seen on those first few slides is that we abstract very close to our point of compression. What that still means is that it's quite a busy waterway. Bristol is a few boats travel up and down, so we obviously want to protect that point of abstraction. And also ensure that we're not in breach of any of their kind of local law. Environmental agencies, so we have abstraction licenses and permits with them to abstract that volume of water, which I mentioned earlier. An environmental evaluation, so we do work with them closely on all the annual requirements around noise or pollution and anything that might be a breach around any kind of refrigerant loss if there were to occur. Star Refrigeration, so as I said, being the original OEM of the equipment, we do use them for consulting around these design improvements as well as optimization. We're working actively with them around making sure that we commission this asset in a way or recommission this asset in a way of working on those lower loads until we do reach our peak demands and ongoing maintenance. As well as our customers being an uninterrupted heating supply for both the heating and the hot water, and obviously replacing the local requirement on fossil fuel dependency. So I think that brings us to the end of that deck. Back to John.
Jump in, yeah. I'm conscious of time, so just to give you a sense of some of the challenges faced on the network in Bristol. There's a lot of infrastructure in the way, like harbours and roads and rail and rivers and so on. So as Jason mentioned, crossing and under harbours is going to be a key focus, particularly in one location here, so we can get more utilisation out of the water source heat pump by connecting two network areas. We've got a local development order in place with the council, which alleviates some of the planning permission required as we build out across the city, and that covers all of the roads that we're expecting to build across. We have a handful of other locations where we're looking at doing other water source heat pumps as well as large scale air source heat pumps. So we've recently submitted a planning application for a very large air source heat pump energy centre near Bath Road down here as well. So just with that, which most of the last slide quickly, I just wanted to let everybody know that we have a newsletter. If you'd like to keep in touch with what we're up to on the Bristol Heat Network, there's often some exciting updates. So please scan the QR code or get in touch with us separately. And that's it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. I'm going to pass straight over to Sam. I know we're essentially at the end of the call, but we will be answering a few questions if you'd like to stick around. So hi, Sam.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, everybody. There's been quite a lot of questions coming through in the chat, so I'm going to summarise some of them. Some of them we're going to take away and we'll reply to offline. So the first one, John, it's sort of linked to your comment just then around considering other water source heat pumps within the city. Does heat extraction impact the ability to deploy heat networks that would then extract heat further down a waterway? Do you have to sort of consider the proximity of those heat pumps?
Proximity is certainly a consideration, but the floating harbour in Bristol is quite a large body of water, and we've had the indication from the Environment Agency that there is capacity for quite a lot more. As it happens, there's actually quite a lot of buildings in Bristol that already access the harbour on an individual basis for either heating or actually more likely cooling in most cases. So there's quite a precedent for it, and certainly the EA have indicated that shouldn't be a problem in terms of the capacity the harbour has to have a heat extracted from it.
Fantastic, thank you. There's been a few questions around wildlife within the rivers. Any challenges there? I guess question for both presenters. Any challenges you've come across? Specifically, beavers seem to have been cropping up.
It's nothing operationally that we've had too much of an issue with. As I said, with our abstraction system, we do have two phases of protection. The only real consideration that we had was around our second phase. So those mussel stop filters primarily have been designed to stop an invasive species of mussels, zebra mussels, namely. But beavers and that kind of level of migration, that's why you have that first screening of level of protection, essentially. But we do work with the EA on any kind of new exposed risks and anything that does come up within our area of operation.
And Amy, from your side?
Yeah, I think very similar as well. When we've spoken with the EA, they haven't mentioned anything explicit in the area. I think when we've done the abstraction and discharge license, that there was kind of reference to, I think it was eels in our area. But again, yeah, nothing kind of show-stopping.
Great. A question regarding cooling. So could the networks be designed in such a way that they could provide cooling using the cooling potential from the rivers? Or is it something that you're considering?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. We've kind of discussed that opportunity as well. At our energy centre, we also do a cooling network, and we have kind of chillers there as well. And we're also looking at kind of the opportunity of, I guess, kind of a cross-functioning one where it can do heating and cooling to complement kind of other systems that we're looking to potentially install as well. So yeah, that is something that we are considering in the kind of wider design.
Fantastic, interesting.
Similarly, in our Brent Cross network, we have a large-scale air source heat pump which does a combination of heating and cooling, so cooling commercial buildings and rejecting that heat into the system for heating residential. We're looking at that in 1 or 2 locations in Bristol, but the cooling density is often a challenge, particularly with retrofit. So it's just potentially quite a discrete location that could be a possibility, but it's certainly on the cards.
Great. And I think my last one, if you had a key takeaway for our attendees today in terms of engaging with stakeholders, there's been a lot of challenges, a lot of discussions that you've talked about today. What would be your sort of key takeaway in terms of engaging with those stakeholders, for example, the Environment Agency? Amy, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably very kind of obvious, but I would say just trying to engage as soon as possible. I think we found that their kind of resource availability varies quite a lot. So the earlier you can engage and talk through the project and kind of get some feedback as well. Like I say, the planning kind of response that we got was very much kind of, here are the guidelines. It says no, we weren't, sure if we came back again, if there was going to be an issue with the jetty or something else like that. So, kind of getting an actual face-to-face or meeting with them is probably quite key to kind of making sure that you're comfortable or they're comfortable in terms of what the project actually is. But like I say, the earlier, the better.
Yeah.
I agree with that, of course, completely. I think the other useful thing is that if you're doing engagement with those sorts of stakeholders, taking them to see something real somewhere, so that they actually can get their head around practically what they're actually looking at approving is also quite a helpful thing to do.
Great. No, I think that's really useful. Always good to build those relationships and ensure that the people that you're talking to understand the art of the possible in regards to this, as there's not too many examples to demonstrate. We are over time. Thank you all so much for joining. I can see people starting to drop off. There were a few questions we haven't got around to. What we'll do is we'll collate those up, share them amongst the speakers today, and share the responses that we can with you. If anybody has any follow-up questions or they would like to be introduced directly to our speakers today, they've shared their emails on screen, but we're more than happy to make those introductions as well. So please do reach out. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.